Hello everyone. I'd like to talk to you today about variables. Now I know that there has been some questions about variables and the different types of variables that you read about in your textbook about research. And so I wanted to try to bring some understanding about those variables here today with just a short video. And so let's start first of all with these two major types of variables: independent and dependent. In research, these two variables are the ones that we're most often concerned with, even though there are others that become very important throughout the process. But whenever you're setting up your study, especially as you're working now on your research proposal, you're setting up your study, you need to be able to define and describe the independent variables and the dependent variable or variables within your study. Now, as with everything, there's great variability, even in variables. Independent variables, you will most likely have at least one, but lots of times dependent variables, you'll have at most one, but you will have one. Very seldom do we see multiple dependent variables, even though it's very possible, but it requires a fairly involved statistical analysis. And so let's talk about these two for just a second. Independent variables, the researcher controls. Now I say that kind of loosely because you may not have just solid control, but this is what is manipulated, is the independent variable. And so if we're thinking about agricultural examples, this could be fertilizer rate, this could be irrigation rates, this could be seeding quantities and rates and travel and time, depending on what you're putting into this experiment. If we're talking about an educational example, it could be the type of instruction that your students are receiving. It could be the type of curriculum that is developed. And so these are things that you introduce, or these are things that you implement in the study. The researcher manipulates this. You can change the levels on this independent variables at lots of times. The dependent variable, this is the measurement. And so if we're looking at an independent variable of maybe seed spacing or plant spacing in corn crops or soybean crops, and we're looking at that as the independent variable, we manipulate that. You can plant them on rows on different widths, and you can plant the plants different lengths apart. And so that's what we manipulate. And the measurement in that, or the dependent variable, is going to be the output, or is going to be the crop increase or decrease that we're going to realize for that. If we're implementing a new educational type of a venture for our students, then that's the independent variable. The dependent variable is going to be some sort of a test where we measure the independent variable. And so the independent variable can change, the researcher determines it. The dependent variable is the result of the independent variable. So kind of the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. And so this one can be changed, and this one changes as a result if there's a relationship of the independent variable. Now, those are the two most basic types of variables and things that you need to think about in your study of what you're going to look at. You may not actually manipulate them. If you're looking back at something that's already happened, you certainly won't be manipulating this independent variable. For example, if you look at people that have had access to health care in the past and the problems that they're having in their life health-wise today, you look back and you didn't manipulate that. You didn't cause them not to have access to health care, or you didn't cause them not to have education, or you didn't cause them not to have a certain socioeconomic status, but you did manipulate it in a way to where you measured it against this dependent variable of some sort, of whatever measurement that you're taking. And so that researcher controls or researcher manipulates is not exactly that you caused it to happen, even though you might in an experimental study, but you didn't cause these factors to happen. You just use those factors as a way to the look at your dependent variable. And so these are what really our whole body of research is based upon, these two types of variables. All right, then there were a couple of types that really caused some questions. And so let me just first talk about moderating variables. Moderating variables you will often see described in the literature as intervening variables. And so they intervene. They come in and you may take two different variables that you're going to look at and you're going to set up two, one as an independent, one as a dependent. And so I saw an example recently that looked at levels of education as the independent variable. And so let me just go ahead and label that as independent variable. Looking at relationship with spending habits or spending, let's say, as the dependent variable. Okay, so this makes sense. There may be, I would guess that there is a relationship between education levels of people in our country and their spending habits. But education doesn't necessarily cause spending, and so you can't say that it's a cause and effect relationship, even though it may be a relationship, which is described as a correlation, as one increases, the other increases, or as one decreases, the other decreases, or as one increases, the other decreases. So you may see a negative relationship. But at any rate, this is the independent variable, this is the dependent variable. Well, there is this independent variable, or this intervening or this moderating variable that comes into play that we could say is their job. And so even though education and spending will have a very strong relationship, I would imagine, the job really is an intervening or a moderating variable. And so, for example, this job really, or their income source really affects their spending. And so their education will probably lead to a different type of job, and then that job leads to a different type of spending, but not always. And so, in the world of academia, there are different, even across campus, there are different types of professions in academia that pay much more than others. You can imagine that an engineering PhD often makes a lot more money than someone in philosophy or someone in English or someone maybe in foreign languages. And so it's not that they had any less education, but they had a lower paying job. And so there you saw this moderating or this intervening variable that was messing with the results that you expected to see on education and spending. And so that's moderating. And then the other one that was mentioned in your book is mediating. And these are things that you don't control, that you need to look out for, that you need to acknowledge. And really, in the end, though, you do your best to steer clear of moderating or mediating variables. But in the end, once again, we go back and relate to another thing that our textbook talked about was assumptions. Often you don't know what's going on in people's lives well enough to be able to account for all the moderating or all the mediating variables. And so you just have to make certain assumptions. And that could be assumptions here dealing with education usually leads to higher paying jobs, and higher paying jobs leads to spending. So therefore it would be reasonable to look at levels of education and spending habits as a reasonable relationship. So this mediating, so this is something that you didn't really see coming often, and you may never see it. You may never realize that it was even there. The example that our book, I believe, used was looking at socioeconomic status versus literacy rates, and I may have that off a little bit, but it's another example if it's not. And so you would expect from previous studies that socioeconomic status would have a relationship with literacy aptitude. But it didn't cause it. I mean, being poor didn't cause a student not to learn to read, or being rich doesn't cause a student to learn to read. But there could be a mediating variable in there. So you could have a group of students with low socioeconomic status, or a group of people that maybe had very caring mothers, very, very caring and really interested in seeing their student, their child develop, that spent extra time with them developing reading skills. And so that's a mediating variable that's going to lessen the effect or change the effect or change the relationship. between your independent variable and your dependent variable. I was at a commodity conference just a few weeks ago, the Kentucky Agricultural Commodity Conference, and they were talking about the effects of the commodity prices dropping and what it has on the agricultural market and even on the producer. And they talked about how in this past year we had a lot of rain, more rain than usual, and so production was up. So the effect that was felt on the market, or the effect that was felt by the producer, wasn't quite as dramatic as what it was predicted to be or what it normally would have been in a normal year, because production was up. So commodity prices dropped. The aftermath didn't hit the farmer or the producer so bad because we had this mediating variable of a very wet year where crop production was really high. And so it kind of offset that a little bit. And so it made the predictions from, as a matter of fact, this was an ag economist giving the speech, it made this prediction and this model look like it was wrong to some extent, but it wasn't, because it was a strangely very wet year. And so that mediated the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. And so I say all this, but I want you to know that the moderating and the mediating are things that we try to steer clear of. Nobody designs a moderating variable. Nobody designs a mediating variable. You look for intervening variables, and you look for ways to safeguard your study against intervening variables, to be able to select participants or select crops or select whatever in a way that distributes these mediating and moderating variables evenly. And the whole answer to that is random selection, which is for another day and another topic, but there are ways to control for these through the random selection of uses of even of experimental designs for different areas, but most of all for participants and for the ways that these spots or people are chosen to be included in the study. And so these are variables: independent, dependent, moderating, mediating. I'm sure there are others. If there's some that come up, I'll try to address those in a future video. As always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask.